Imagine this: the legendary bassist and singer Glenn Hughes, whose deep voice used to fill arenas, is now speaking in low tones about a topic that has long been forgotten in rock history: his tense and traumatic relationship with Gary Moore. Moore has long been revered by fans as a guitar god whose fingertips evoked unadulterated passion with each chord. But there was a far darker truth hidden beneath the fiery blues riffs and brilliant solos. One of suffering, broken relationships, and an unrelenting path of strife that persisted until his death. Moore had an unquestionably brilliant career, but it was a shaky, troubled life tainted by his own intransigence. Although he frequently left mayhem in his path, he was a man who wanted excellence. Fans may anticipate a tale of musical harmony, but Hughes' time together was anything but. It was a battleground. Two natural forces, each endowed with a powerful personality, collided in ways that left scars too deep to mend. Hughes and other powerful musicians who had a strong passion for rock and blues seemed to be a marriage made in musical heaven in the early 1918s. However, their partnership was a battlefield of expectations and egos behind the scenes. Hughes' free-spirited, spontaneous style ran against Moore's unrelenting quest for perfection. Imagine the stress during such recordings. Hughes, motivated by passion and spontaneity, pushed for raw fire and soul, whereas Moore, painstakingly crafting each note, demanded accuracy. Despite their initial alignment, their artistic perspectives quickly became a cause of contention. Hughes' well-known battles with addiction only served to stoke the flames. And Moore, who never holds back, became more and more irritated with Hughes' unreliability. The tipping point was when Hughes' personal issues started to interfere with his performances, and Moore, who was always the stickler for detail, decided to split ways. It was a painful breakup that left a trail of bitterness and unsaid words in its wake. For Hughes, it was just one more traumatic period in a life full of hardships. Moore saw it as just another strained partnership in a long line. However, Hughes wasn't the only musician who disagreed with Moore. Moore had an intermittent involvement with Thin Lizzy and its dynamic leader, Phil Lynott, in the late 1970s. Although Moore had joined the band at a pivotal moment and contributed his virtuoso guitar playing to their sound, Lynott's carefree, party-filled lifestyle frequently clashed with his strong nature and rigorous standards. Despite their strong musical chemistry, the two's closeness was overshadowed by their displeasure with one another. Moore struggled to cope with Thin Lizzy's chaotic lifestyle, and his mounting displeasure with Lynott's escalating drug usage resulted in heated clashes. Once characterized by mutual respect, their relationship soured, and Moore abruptly quit the band in the middle of 1979, leaving Lynott and the other members in the dark. Their falling out remained one of the most devastating rifts in rock for years. Following Lynott's tragic death in 1986, Moore later expressed sadness for their unsolved concerns. Moore joined two rock icons, Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, in the short-lived supergroup BBM in the 1990s in an attempt to reignite his magic. On paper, the lineup seemed ideal: Moore's blazing guitar work, Baker's flaming drumming, and Bruce's pounding bass lines. However, it was actually a ticking time bomb. As Cream veterans, Bruce and Baker already had a history of conflict, which Moore's controlling demeanor only exacerbated. Every rehearsal was a battlefield due to disagreements over creative direction, competing egos, and the weight of their respective legacies. Sharp-tongued Bruce frequently disagreed with Moore's direct style, and Baker's capricious nature only served to exacerbate an already tense situation. Although the band only put out one album, Around the Next Dream, the fissures were already apparent behind the scenes. Moore's annoyance at the lack of order and unity resulted in contentious arguments, and eventually the project fell apart due to its internal conflicts. In addition to his work life, Moore's fiery demeanor also permeated his personal connections. The same problems that plagued his career, control, perfectionism, and an unwillingness to compromise, also afflicted his marriages. His unwavering commitment to music left little time for family life, and his first marriage ended in divorce. His second marriage was equally affected by his erratic temperament and extended absences from traveling, despite its moments of affection. His absence was frequently felt by his children, who were raised in the shadow of their father's unrelenting quest for musical glory. Imagine a young Moore who is constantly playing his guitar, unaware of the passing of time, missing birthdays, and foregoing family get-togethers in the service of his art. Even though he loved them, his incapacity to find equilibrium caused wounds that would take years to heal. Despite not being as well known as Hughes' struggles, Moore battled his own issues, including an alcohol addiction and a growing sense of loneliness that came with his popularity. He felt a lot of pressure to live up to his reputation as his career developed. The music that used to make him happy became both his haven and his jail, and evenings that ought to have been spent celebrating instead became lonely battles with the bottle. As the years of excess caught up with him, he experienced depressive episodes, which negatively impacted his mental health in his latter years. Friends and co-workers frequently characterized him as a man who was always struggling to find the serenity he so dearly desired, carrying the burden of his own aspirations on his shoulders. Gary Moore found himself lost in a world that had once adored him but now appeared to have moved on as the years went by. The unrelenting drive that had propelled him to stardom, the unadulterated fervor that had pierced every chord of his guitar, started to fade. The concerts became smaller, the tours less frequent, and the once vibrant records took on a somber and reflective tone. He could no longer flee the demons that had pursued him for decades on the stage, his haven, and his battlefield. Rather, it turned into a menacing reminder of who he was and who he would never be. Consider the difference. Once a dominant figure who played guitar with tremendous emotion in front of thousands of people, Moore is now sitting by himself in dimly lit dressing rooms, looking in the mirror and trying to find the guy he once was. He was still bound to the ghosts of his past, and his once thriving career that defined him had slowed to a crawl, leaving him alone in a world that thrived on reinvention. The fire that had burned so brightly within him flickered in the darkness of remorse and loneliness as partnerships fell apart and friends drifted away. Moore never really left, even though the tempo slowed. He was still touring and recording, but something had shifted. A contemplative, almost melancholy tone had taken the place of the fierceness that had earlier characterized his voice. He gave the blues everything he had, but the fight was in his life, not just in the music. Every performance was an appeal for connection and purpose beyond the world he had created around his instrument, in addition to an effort to recover his position in rock history. However, the more he turned to music for comfort, the more it seemed to float away. The inevitable occurred in 2011. Moore's heart eventually failed while he was alone in a hotel room in Spain, away from the supportive fans and the rock scene's brotherhood. The man who had pushed himself to the utmost limits of his craft and spirit, who had lived life to the fullest, met a quiet but painful end. There was only the icy quiet of a life that had burnt too quickly and too fiercely, no fans yelling or an encore. The music industry was rocked by the news of his passing, but those closest to him knew it had been long overdue. Moore had been battling an invisible struggle of loneliness, sorrow, and a never-ending quest for something he could never quite discover. Although there were many unanswered questions, his legacy was indisputable. What might have been? What if he had reconciled his inner demons? What if he had given himself permission to savor the success he had merited? A portrait of a man who had dedicated himself fully to his work but perhaps never sufficiently to himself emerged as tributes flooded in. Moore's life served as a warning about both genius and hardship, success and tragedy. His death was more than just the loss of a talented musician, it was the end of a book full of untapped possibilities, unsolved disputes, and a never-ending yearning for something more than the strings of his guitar. The legacy of Gary Moore is a frightening paradox, a man burdened by the remains of his own unrelenting quest for perfection, but also an artist of incredible talent. With each note brimming with unadulterated passion and unbridled strength, his guitar conveyed in ways that words could never. However, beneath that skill was a terribly troubled spirit that found comfort in music but battled continuously with the interpersonal relationships that ought to have kept him rooted. Moore's relationships were frequently tumultuous, emotional, and ultimately unsatisfied, much like his fiery solos. His renowned altercations with musicians like Phil Lynott, Glenn Hughes, and Jack Bruce were more than just passing arguments. Vision and ego collided in deep, emotionally intense collisions. Moore's relationships with his peers were frequently characterized by tension rather than camaraderie, whether it was Hughes' free-spirited approach to music clashing with Moore's precision or Lynot's chaotic rock-and-roll lifestyle clashing with his more structured discipline. Moore was a man who demanded everything from himself and expected nothing less from those around him. These disputes went beyond simple artistic disagreements, they were identity wars, fought over the unwavering demand for control and artistic integrity. Imagine a man who, while performing, battled loneliness and a constant sensation of discontent as his fingers skillfully crafted complex tunes offstage. Moore appeared to never be satisfied with success. His desire for more was only stoked by each successful album and sold-out performance. He never stopped striving for the ideal moment, the ideal band, or the ideal sound, which always appeared to be just out of grasp. He also left a legacy of ruined relationships, missed chances, and scars that time would never fully heal as a result of his quest. His narrative serves as a sobering reminder that excellence frequently comes at a high cost, even as his music continues to inspire generations. Every riff and every song reflected the emotional cost of Moore's unyielding character, yet the consequences of his decisions weighed him down like an unrelenting shadow outside the stage lights. His influence was incalculable, and his genius was indisputable. However, his life served as a stark reminder that even the most talented artists can struggle with their personal issues. Every admirer who appreciates the spirit in his songs also recognizes the artist who created it. A man who, in spite of his brilliance, was left yearning for something more profound, something more significant than the audience's short-lived cheers. Ultimately, Gary Moore's legacy is a bittersweet reflection of a life spent striving for perfection at the sacrifice of one's own happiness, in addition to being a celebration of his artistic talent. And that's possibly the saddest note of all.